On the morning of August the 22nd, 1986, in the highlands of Cameroon in West Africa, a man rode his motorcycle down a familiar road toward the villages below a lake. It was a route he had taken many times. The air was cool, the hills were green, the morning was quiet, and then he began to notice something wrong. There were animals lying by the roadside, not moving. Cattle, goats, birds, not injured, not attacked, simply still. He kept riding, and there were more, and more. And then he reached the first village, and he found the people. Everything in the village was intact. The houses stood untouched. Doors were still on their hinges. Pots were still on the fires. Belongings sat exactly where they had been left. There was no fire damage, no flood damage, no sign of any storm or violence. Not a single thing broken or burned or swept away. The village looked completely, perfectly normal, except that nothing in it was alive. Not a person, not an animal, not so much as an insect. In the space of a single night, in villages around that quiet lake, roughly 1,700 people had died, along with thousands upon thousands of their livestock, and yet the world around them had not been disturbed in any way at all. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the strangest things that has ever happened on our planet. Whatever came through those valleys in the night killed nearly every living thing it touched, and left every single object exactly as it was. It did not burn, it did not smash, it did not drown, it did not wound. Think about what kind of force that even leaves room for. Almost everything we can imagine that kills on a massive scale, fire, flood, storm, landslide, explosion, wrecks the world along with the lives in it. This did not. It was as though the villages had simply, silently, been switched off. And there is one more detail about that morning that makes it even harder to process. The disaster was not confined to a single village. As people began to travel through the region, the same scene repeated itself again and again across a wide area below the lake. Community after community spread across several valleys, all of them still, all of them intact, all of them silent. This was not a localized accident that struck one unlucky settlement. Whatever had come out of that lake had reached across a substantial stretch of countryside, following the low ground for kilometers, and it had found essentially everyone in its path. And in among the stillness, there were survivors, a scattering of people who had somehow lived through it, and their accounts only deepened the mystery. Many of them described not a struggle, not a warning, not an attack, but simply losing consciousness and then waking, hours later, into a world that had been emptied while they slept. The people who arrived in those first hours had no framework to understand what they were seeing. They had no idea what had happened. And remarkably, neither did the wider world, not at first. Because the thing that killed those villages was something so unusual, so rarely witnessed, that it did not initially occur to anyone. The killer had already vanished by the time anyone arrived. It left no trace, no residue, no clue you could easily see. It had come out of the lake in the night, done its work, and dispersed into the air, leaving behind an intact, silent, empty world. Over the next 40 minutes, we are going to solve this. We're going to go back to the night of August the 21st, 1986, and reconstruct exactly what came out of that lake and swept down into those valleys. We're going to follow the investigators who arrived in the aftermath and rule out, one by one, every explanation they could think of, until only one impossible answer was left. And what we find is going to change the way you think about something as ordinary and harmless as a quiet body of water, and about a substance that is, at this very moment, moving in and out of your own lungs. If you want to work through this mystery with me, from the first silent morning to the final, extraordinary answer, make sure you're subscribed before we begin. Because this is a story where the truth is stranger than any of the theories, and where the killer turns out to be something you have never once been afraid of in your life. So let's start with the lake, because in this story, the lake is everything. High in the northwest of Cameroon, in a region of ancient volcanic hills, sits a body of water called Lake Nyos. And on any ordinary day, in the years before that night, it was beautiful. It filled the bowl of an old volcanic crater, ringed by steep slopes, its water calm and deep, and at the surface a clear blue. It looked serene. It looked like exactly the sort of place you'd want to build a life beside. And people had. In the valleys below the lake, communities lived and farmed and raised their animals, generation after generation, in the fertile land beneath those green hills. They had no reason to fear the water. The lake did not flood them. It did not steam or bubble or roar. It sat there, still and quiet, year after year, doing nothing at all. And that is the thing to hold on to as we go into this. Whatever was building inside that lake was building in total silence. There was no warning, no smoke, no tremors that anyone paid attention to, no visible sign that anything at all was wrong. The people who lived below the lake were not ignoring the danger. They could not see the danger because the danger did not look like anything. To every eye that ever fell on it, Lake Nyos was just a lake. And beneath its calm blue surface, invisible, patient, and utterly silent, something enormous had been accumulating for a very long time. And on the night of the 21st of August, 1986, it came out. Nobody who was close enough to the lake to see exactly what happened that night survived to describe it in full. Our picture of the event has been pieced together from those who were further away, from survivors on the fringes, and from the physical evidence the lake and the valleys left behind. But that picture, assembled carefully, is genuinely chilling. Sometime in the evening, people in the region heard a sound. Accounts describe something like a rumble, a distant boom, some kind of deep noise coming from the direction of the lake. It was not a huge, obvious explosion that shook the world. It was a sound strange enough to notice, but not so terrifying that people fled. Some heard it and thought little of it. Some went to bed. And then, from the surface of Lake Nyos, something began to rise. Out of the water came a cloud. Not a cloud of fire, not a plume of ash. A cloud of gas, mixed with a fine spray of water, surging up out of the lake in a colossal, violent release. Whatever was happening in that water, it was happening fast, and it was happening on a scale that is hard to picture. The lake erupted upward, throwing a column of gas and water high into the air, hundreds of feet, a sudden violent outburst from a body of water that had been utterly still for as long as anyone could remember. And the water itself was thrown into chaos. The release was violent enough to send waves surging across the lake and up the shorelines. On some slopes around the lake, there is evidence that water was flung dozens of meters up the surrounding hillsides, stripping the vegetation as it went. The surface of the lake, which had been that beautiful, clear blue, changed color entirely, turning a deep, murky, rusty red. Something from far down in the depths, water that had never been at the surface, had been violently churned up and thrown into the open air, and it carried with it the chemistry of the deep. There is one more clue in the physical evidence that would prove crucial later, and it concerns the water itself. That striking change in color, from clear blue to a deep rusty red, was not cosmetic. It was a signature. It was the lake telling investigators, in the only language it had, that its deep water had been brought violently to the surface. The bottom water of Lake Nyos is rich in dissolved iron, and iron behaves very differently depending on whether it is sitting in the dark, oxygen-poor depths, or exposed to the open air. Bring that deep, iron-rich water up into contact with the atmosphere, and the iron reacts and turns a reddish, rusty color, staining the whole lake. So that unnerving change in the water was hard physical proof of exactly what had happened, that something had reached down into the bottom of the lake and hauled the deep layer up to the surface with tremendous force. The lake had turned itself inside out. And think about the timing, because it is part of what made this so lethal. It happened in the evening and through the night, when people were inside their homes and asleep. Had this occurred in the middle of a working day, many people would have been out in the fields, on the higher ground, moving around, awake and able to notice something and climb. Instead, the gas arrived while the villages lay in the low ground, still and unaware, at the very hour when almost everyone was in the exact place where the danger would settle deepest. It was, in that sense, the worst possible time for it to happen. But none of that is what killed anyone. The waves stayed near the lake. The eruption of water was confined to the crater. The thing that came for the villages was the gas, because that enormous cloud of gas released from the lake was heavier than the air around it. And so it did not rise up and blow away into the sky. It sank. It poured back down out of the air, sank to the ground, and began to flow downhill like an invisible liquid, following the shape of the land. Picture it. A vast, invisible flood of gas, colorless, moving out from the lake and pouring down the slopes, seeking the low ground, filling the valleys the way water fills a basin. It moved with the terrain, down the natural channels, into the dips and hollows, into precisely the places where people had built their homes, because people always build in the sheltered low ground near water and good soil. It flowed in the darkness, silently, and it did not glow or shimmer or smell of anything that would make you run. It could travel for kilometers. It went into the valleys, and it filled them, and it displaced the air that was already there. And that is how it killed. Not by burning, not by poisoning in the way we usually think of poison, but by taking the place of the air. Where that gas flowed, there was no longer breathable air, and any living thing inside it, human or animal, was in an environment that could not sustain life. It happened at night, when almost everyone was asleep and unaware, in a landscape with no warning sound, no smell, and nothing to see in the dark. And this is why the aftermath looked the way it did. This is why the houses were untouched and the cattle were lying in the fields. A gas does not break down doors or burn thatch. It simply arrives, silently, and it moves on. By the morning, the gas had dispersed, thinning out into the atmosphere until it was harmless again, leaving behind the silent world that the motorcyclist rode into. The killer had already left the scene. And when the outside world finally arrived to try and make sense of the disaster, they found something that seemed to defy every explanation they could offer. Because at that point, nobody knew that a lake could do this. Nobody knew that a lake was even capable of such a thing. And the investigation that followed had to work its way through a list of suspects, ruling them out one by one, until the only answer left was one that sounded, at first, completely absurd. Put yourself in the position of the first investigators arriving in the days after. You are standing in a landscape that makes no sense, and your job is to work out what could possibly have done this. So you start, as any investigator does, by listing what you actually know, the hard evidence, the things the scene is telling you. Fact 1. Almost every living thing in these valleys is dead, humans and animals alike, over a wide area. Fact 2. Nothing built or made has been damaged. No fire, no blast damage, no flood damage, no collapsed structures. Fact 3. It happened at night, quickly and quietly enough that people did not flee. Fact 4. Some people, further away or higher up, survived, and they described strange things. A smell like rotten eggs or gunpowder, a sensation of warmth, and then losing consciousness, waking up hours later to find their families and their animals gone. Fact 5. Up at the lake, the water has changed color, and there is evidence of some violent disturbance, waves that ran up the shores, vegetation stripped along the shoreline. Now, with those facts in hand, you start going through the suspects. And here's where the mystery deepens, because every obvious explanation collapses when you hold it against the evidence. Was it a volcanic eruption? The region is volcanic, and the lake sits in an old crater, so that is the very first thought. But no. A volcanic eruption in the usual sense means lava, or a blast of superheated ash, or falling rock. And there is none of that. There is no lava anywhere. There is no thick blanket of volcanic ash burying the villages. The buildings are not scorched or buried or blown apart. Whatever happened, the classic picture of a volcano erupting simply does not match what is on the ground. Was it a chemical attack? This was suggested at the time, and you can understand why. It is one of the very few things people could think of that kills living beings on a large scale and leaves the building standing. But the evidence against it mounts quickly. There is no delivery mechanism, no craters, no aircraft, no containers, no motive that makes any sense in this remote agricultural region. And crucially, the disturbance is centered on the lake itself. The waves, the changed water color, the stripped shoreline. Whatever happened, it came out of the lake. That does not fit an attack from outside. Was it a disease, some sudden plague? No. Diseases do not sweep through a valley in a single night and kill nearly every human and nearly every animal simultaneously across many species and then stop dead. The pattern is completely wrong. Disease takes days, spreads unevenly, spares many. This killed almost everything at once, and then it was over. Was it a poisoned water supply? Also no. People die from poisoned water when they drink it. This killed people who never touched the lake that night, killed them where they slept, killed cattle in fields, killed birds that had never gone near the water. The killer reached them where they were. It moved. And that last point is the crucial one. It moved. It reached into homes and fields and hollows across a wide area, killed nearly everything living, and left everything non-living untouched. When you strip away every explanation that doesn't fit, you are left staring at a single extraordinary conclusion. The killer was not a solid. It was not a liquid. It was something that could flow into every space, reach every living creature, and yet leave a clay pot sitting undisturbed on a shelf. The killer was a gas, an enormous volume of gas that came out of the lake and flowed down into the valleys. And once you accept that, everything on the scene suddenly clicks into place. The intact houses, the dead animals in the open fields, the survivors on the high ground, and the deaths in the low ground. The people who lost consciousness and woke hours later. The suffocating, silent, spreading nature of it. Every single piece of evidence fits a heavy gas flowing across the land in the dark. And here is what makes the investigation so remarkable in hindsight. The scientists who came to Cameroon were not simply confirming a known phenomenon. They were encountering something that was, in practical terms, off the map of established hazards. There was no chapter in any textbook titled, "When Lakes Explode." Nobody arrived expecting to find that a body of fresh water had killed 1,000 people, because nothing in the accumulated experience of science said that was a thing lakes could do. The investigators had to reason their way to an answer that their own field had never seriously entertained, and they had to do it from a scene that had already erased its own evidence, because the murder weapon had blown away into the sky before anyone got there. This is why the survivors' testimony mattered so much. Their descriptions of losing consciousness without pain or struggle, of waking hours later, of a strange smell, of the absence of any violence, were the fingerprints of a gas. And it is also why the pattern of who lived and who died was so revealing. Survival correlated again and again with height. People who were higher up, on slopes or ridges or upper floors, tended to survive. People who were in the low ground did not. That is not the pattern of a disease or a poison in the water or an attack. That is the unmistakable pattern of something dense flowing along the ground and pooling in the hollows exactly the way water would. The land itself had shaped who lived and who died, and that fact pointed, like an arrow, straight at the answer. But it also raises a question so strange that it is hard to even ask with a straight face. Where does a lake get a colossal cloud of deadly gas? Because that is what the evidence is now demanding we believe. That a calm, blue, ordinary-looking lake in Cameroon was somehow holding, inside itself, enough lethal gas to kill everything for kilometers around. And that on that one night, it let it all out at once. It sounds absurd. Lakes do not do that. Lakes have never done that. Not in any story any of these investigators had ever heard. Except this one did. And to understand how, you have to understand what was hiding in the deep water of Lake Nyos, quietly, for a very long time before anyone was there to see it. The answer begins deep underground, beneath the lake. Lake Nyos sits in the crater of an old volcano, and although that volcano is not erupting in any conventional sense, the volcanic system beneath it is not entirely dead. Deep below, there is still activity, still heat, still the slow processes of a volcanic region. And one thing volcanic systems do, even quiet ones, is release gas. In particular, they release carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is not exotic. It is not some strange alien chemical. It is one of the most ordinary substances on the planet. It's in the air right now. You breathe it out with every breath you take. It's the gas in fizzy drinks. It is utterly commonplace, and in the amounts we normally encounter it, completely harmless, which is what makes this story so unsettling. The murderer here is not some exotic poison. It is a substance that is inside you at this very moment. So beneath Lake Nyos, volcanic carbon dioxide was seeping upward, slowly, steadily, and entering the water at the very bottom of the lake. And here is where the peculiar magic of this particular lake comes in. In most lakes around the world, that gas would simply bubble up to the surface and drift away, and nothing would ever accumulate. But in Lake Nyos, the gas did not escape. It dissolved into the deep water and it stayed there. It built up. Year after year, decade after decade, the deep water of the lake became more and more saturated with dissolved carbon dioxide, charging up like a battery, and none of it came out. Why? Two reasons, and they work together. The first is pressure. Lake Nyos is deep, and the water at the bottom of a deep lake is under enormous pressure from all the water piled above it. And pressure is what allows gas to stay dissolved in a liquid. This is exactly the principle of a bottle of fizzy drink. That bottle is full of liquid with a huge amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in it, and the reason it doesn't fizz out is that it is sealed under pressure. The gas is held in solution by the pressure. Lake Nyos was doing the same thing. The weight of hundreds of feet of water was acting like the cap on a bottle, holding the carbon dioxide dissolved in the deep layers. The second reason is that the lake did not mix. Most lakes in the world turn over. As the seasons change and the surface water cools, that colder, denser surface water sinks, and the deeper water rises, and the whole lake churns and mixes and refreshes itself, usually once or twice a year. If Lake Nyos had done that, it would have gently released its gas over time in small, harmless amounts. But it did not. In the steady tropical climate, with its particular depth and shape and chemistry, the layers of Lake Nyos stayed stubbornly separate. The deep water stayed deep. It never came up, never mixed, never vented. So the gas that dissolved in it just kept accumulating, sealed under pressure, silent and invisible, for a very long time. Do you see what that means? Lake Nyos had become, in effect, an enormous bottle of soda water, shaken up and sealed shut. A vast reservoir of gas held in solution by pressure alone, sitting in the deep, waiting. And it had been quietly charging itself for years. All that was needed to unleash it was something, anything that would disturb the layers, that would bring some of that deep, gas-saturated water up toward the surface, where the pressure would suddenly be lower. And on the night of August the 21st, 1986, something did. We are not certain exactly what triggered it. It could have been a landslide sliding down the steep crater walls into the water. It could have been a sudden cooling of the surface water, or heavy rain, or some internal shift in the lake. But whatever the trigger, some of that deep supercharged water was displaced upward. And that is when the physics turned catastrophic. Because as soon as that deep water rose, the pressure on it dropped. And when the pressure drops, gas that has been held in solution comes out of solution. It bubbles, exactly like opening the cap on that bottle. And here is the terrifying part. As soon as bubbles formed in that deep water, the water became lighter, more buoyant, because it was now full of bubbles. So it rose faster. And as it rose faster, the pressure on it dropped faster. So even more gas came out of solution, making it even more buoyant, making it rise even faster still. It was a runaway chain reaction, a feedback loop that fed on itself, accelerating in seconds, tearing the gas out of the entire deep layer of the lake in one catastrophic burst. That is the sound people heard. That is the column of water and gas that erupted from the lake and threw waves up the crater walls. In a matter of moments, Lake Nyos violently expelled an enormous volume of carbon dioxide, an amount so vast it's hard to comprehend, all of it hitting the open air at once. The bottle had been opened, and now that colossal cloud of carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere, and it did what carbon dioxide does. Because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, denser than the ordinary atmosphere around us, it sank. It hugged the ground, and it flowed downhill into the valleys, silent and colorless and odorless, filling the low places where people slept and pushing the breathable air out ahead of it. And it's worth being very clear about why carbon dioxide kills. because it is not what most people assume. Carbon dioxide is not a poison in the way that, say, cyanide is a poison. It is not corrosive. It doesn't destroy tissue on contact. It does something much simpler and, in a way, much more chilling. It takes the place of the air. When a huge volume of carbon dioxide floods into a low-lying area, it pushes the ordinary air out. And ordinary air is what we need, because ordinary air contains oxygen. Fill a valley with carbon dioxide, and there is simply nothing left in it to breathe. Any living creature inside that space, human or animal, is in an environment that cannot sustain life, no matter how healthy or strong or careful it is. And the horror of it is compounded by how undetectable it is. Carbon dioxide has no color. In a large enough concentration, it has no useful smell to warn you. It does not sting your eyes or make you cough in the way a genuinely irritating gas might. There is no alarm built into your body that fires and says, "This air is wrong, run." At high concentrations, people lose consciousness quickly, and if they are asleep already, they may never wake at all. There is no moment of realization, no chance to flee. It is a hazard perfectly designed by pure accident of chemistry to slip past every defense a human being has. That is why so many of the survivors describe nothing more dramatic than falling asleep and waking up much later. There was nothing to fight. And notice how the gas behaves in a landscape. Because it is denser than air, it does not disperse upward and away. It sinks and it flows and it collects. It behaves for all practical purposes like an invisible liquid, running downhill, pooling in basins, filling valleys from the bottom up. If you could have seen it that night, you would have watched a colorless flood spreading out from the crater and running down every gully and channel in the land, seeking the lowest points, exactly as a river of water would. And the lowest points, the sheltered valleys with their good soil and their access to water, are precisely where people build their homes. The geography of the disaster was written into the geography of the land long before it happened. And in that, we finally have our killer, and the complete explanation for that impossible, untouched, silent morning. Now, if you're following this closely, an obvious and rather urgent question should be forming in your mind. If a lake can do this, why isn't it happening all the time? There are millions of lakes on this planet. People live beside them everywhere. Should we all be afraid of the water? And the answer, thankfully, is no, and understanding why is important, because it tells us exactly what makes a lake like Nyos so rare and so specific. To build a killer lake, you need an unusual combination of ingredients, and all of them have to be present at once. First, you need a source of gas. That means the lake has to sit on top of a volcanic system that is quietly leaking carbon dioxide up into it. That immediately rules out the overwhelming majority of lakes in the world. Most lakes are not sitting on a volcanic gas vent. Your local lake almost certainly has nothing feeding gas into its depths at all. Second, you need great depth. You need enough water piled up to create the pressure that keeps the gas dissolved. A shallow lake cannot hold gas in solution this way because there simply isn't enough weight of water to act as the cap on the bottle. Any gas entering a shallow lake would just bubble up and out, continuously and harmlessly. And third, and this is the crucial one, you need a lake that does not turn over. You need water that stays stubbornly stratified, with the deep layer never rising and never mixing with the surface. Most lakes in temperate parts of the world mix at least once a year as the seasons change, and that mixing is a natural safety valve, gently releasing anything that has built up. A lake that mixes annually cannot become a bomb because it diffuses itself every single year. Lake Nyos, sitting in a warm, stable tropical setting with its particular depth and shape, did not mix. Its safety valve did not exist. Put those three conditions together, a volcanic gas source, great depth, and permanent stratification, and you understand why this is not a global threat, but an extraordinarily specific one. In fact, only a small handful of lakes in the entire world are known to do this. Lake Nyos is one. Nearby Lake Manoon, in the same region of Cameroon, is another, and in fact it had a smaller deadly gas release of its own a couple of years before the Nyos disaster, killing dozens of people, though at the time no one fully understood what had happened. and the warning went unheeded. And then there is Lake Kivu, on the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a vastly larger lake with enormous quantities of dissolved gas in its depths, and with millions of people living around its shores. That one is a subject of serious ongoing scientific attention, for reasons you can now understand perfectly well. There is a tragedy hidden inside this rarity, and it deserves to be said plainly. The disaster at Lake Nyos was not, strictly speaking, the first warning. 2 years earlier, at nearby Lake Manoon, a smaller version of the very same phenomenon occurred. A gas release in the early morning killed dozens of people in the low ground near that lake. At the time, it was not understood. Explanations were offered that did not fit. The idea that a lake could belch out a lethal cloud of carbon dioxide was so far outside anyone's expectations that the event did not trigger the alarm it should have. And so the warning was, in effect, missed. 2 years later, the same mechanism, on a far larger scale, killed roughly 1,700 people at Nyos. That is a hard thing to sit with. It is one of those moments in the history of science where a phenomenon knocked on the door, was not recognized, and then returned with catastrophic force. It is not a story of negligence by any individual. It is a story about the limits of what we know, and about how genuinely new a hazard has to be before we are able to see it clearly. The people who studied Manoon were not fools. They were confronting something that had no precedent in the scientific literature they had. It took Nyos and the terrible scale of it to force the world to understand that lakes could do this at all. So the phenomenon is real, it is rare, and it is understood. But that understanding only came at a terrible price, and it left the survivors of Nyos with an unbearable problem. Because once scientists worked out what had happened, they realized something deeply disturbing about the lake that had just killed 1,700 people. The volcanic system underneath it had not stopped. The carbon dioxide was still seeping up into the deep water, which meant that Lake Nyos, having just detonated, was quietly, patiently beginning to charge itself up all over again. Imagine being told that. Imagine being one of the survivors, or one of the people who eventually returned to that region, and being told that the lake that killed your family is refilling with the very thing that did it. That the bottle is being resealed and shaken once more, and that in some number of years it could reach a point where it might do it all again. The disaster was not a one-time event that had passed. It was a cycle, and unless someone did something, the countdown had simply restarted. But this is where the story turns, and where it becomes unexpectedly a story about human ingenuity rather than only human tragedy. Because scientists and engineers looked at that lake and asked a simple, brilliant question. If the danger is that the gas builds up until it all comes out at once, then what if we let it out slowly, on purpose, a little at a time, before it can ever accumulate to a lethal level? What if we could defuse the bomb by simply, safely, letting the lake fizz? And the method they came up with is elegant almost to the point of beauty, because it uses the very physics that made the lake dangerous in the first place and turns it into the solution. They installed pipes, long vertical pipes, running from near the bottom of the lake, down in the deep gas-saturated water, all the way up to the surface. And here's the clever part. Once you get that deep water moving up the pipe, the process becomes self-sustaining, and you don't need to pump it at all. Because as the deep water rises inside the pipe, the pressure on it drops, and gas comes out of solution and forms bubbles. And those bubbles make the water in the pipe lighter, which makes it rise faster, which makes more gas come out, and so on. That is exactly the same runaway feedback loop that caused the catastrophe. But now it is confined inside a pipe, controlled, aimed. Instead of the entire deep layer of the lake erupting at once in an uncontrolled burst, a single steady column of gas-charged water rushes up the pipe and blasts out at the surface in a fountain, spraying water into the air and releasing its carbon dioxide harmlessly in a thin, continuous, manageable stream. A permanent, self-powered vent, a tap left running, quietly bleeding the pressure out of the bomb. And it works. Fountains of water now spray from the surface of Lake Nyos, driven entirely by the gas escaping from below, and over the years those pipes have drawn down the dangerous store of carbon dioxide in the deep water enormously, dramatically reducing the risk of another catastrophic release. Human beings looked at a lake that had killed 1,700 people, understood precisely why it did it, and then reached in and diffused it, using nothing but pipes and physics. There is something genuinely moving about that. It is one of the quiet triumphs of science, and it is the reason that this story does not end in the dark. It is worth pausing on what happened to the people, because this is not only a story about physics. The communities around Lake Nyos were shattered. Those who survived lost, in a single night, their families, their neighbors, their livestock, which for a farming community is not merely property, but the entire foundation of a livelihood. Survivors were evacuated from the area, and for many years the region below the lake was considered too dangerous to return to. People who had lived on that land for generations found themselves displaced, living elsewhere, unable to go home, waiting on scientists and engineers to determine whether their valley would ever be safe again. The degassing project was not just a technical exercise, it was the precondition for anyone ever being able to live there again. Behind every pipe lowered into that water is the question of whether a community gets its home back. And that is a reminder of something that matters when we talk about natural hazards in the abstract. These processes are fascinating, and it is right to be amazed by the physics. But at the far end of the physics, there are always people, in this case ordinary farming families, who went to sleep beside a beautiful lake and did nothing whatsoever to deserve what came out of it. Understanding the mechanism is not just an intellectual pleasure. It is the only thing that lets anyone live safely beside that water again. But it does leave us with something to think about, and it is the thing I keep coming back to. The people who lived below Lake Nyos were not careless. They were not ignoring a warning. They lived beside a beautiful, calm, apparently harmless lake, in a green and fertile valley, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that they could see or hear or smell that would have told them what was accumulating in the deep water below. The danger was invisible, silent and slow, building over years in a place no one could see, until one night it simply arrived. That is a very particular kind of horror. Not a monster, not a violent cataclysm, but a quiet, ordinary place that had been holding its breath for a very long time and finally let it out. And I think that is the real lesson of Lake Nyos. Our planet does not only kill with fire and force, with eruptions and earthquakes and waves. It also has these quiet mechanisms, these slow, invisible processes that build in silence in places we would never think to look, and that we only discovered because one of them went off. Before 1986, essentially nobody knew that a lake could do this. It was not in the textbooks. It was not a recognized hazard. We learned it in the worst possible way, by counting the cost afterward. Which raises the question that I cannot shake, and I'd love to know what you think about it in the comments. How many other quiet mechanisms are out there? How many other processes are slowly, silently charging up somewhere on this planet, in some form we have not yet imagined, simply because they have not happened yet within the span of our recorded observation? Lake Nyos taught us that a place can look completely, utterly harmless and still be lethal. The world is not always dangerous in the ways we expect it to be. So the next time you stand at the edge of a still, calm lake, and it lies there flat and blue and silent, you'll know something that no one knew before that night in Cameroon. That water can hold its breath, that the most peaceful surface in the world can sit on top of something enormous, and that our planet keeps some of its most powerful secrets in the quietest places of all. If this story stayed with you, tell me what surprised you most in the comments and subscribe, because the Earth is full of these hidden mechanisms, and we are going to keep uncovering them one by one and understanding them before they surprise us again. Because the most dangerous thing about Lake Nyos was never the gas. It was the fact that nobody knew it was there. And the only real protection any of us has ever had against the hidden mechanisms of this planet is the patient, unglamorous work of understanding them before they speak.